We invite you to this session. It's a trialogue on the topic competition laws, revisioning competition laws in the digital age. We have with us as a moderator, Shweta Rajpal Kohli, Head Public Policy, Sequoia Capital, Dr. Shubhashis Gangopadhyay, Managing Trustee, IDF Research, and Dr. Rajat Kathuria, Director of ICRIER. With that, I request Shweta to please take over the proceedings.
Thank you so much, Amitayu. It is really an interesting subject and a very, very relevant one in today's times. Clearly, the explosion in the digital economy has sent policy makers as well as regulators into a tizzy, and there is a larger debate that has been sparked off, not just here, but around the globe, on whether there is a need to revisit competition laws in the wake of the kind of growth that we're seeing in the tech ecosystem. How much of the data explosion that we talk about needs to be accounted for when we think about competition, anti-competitive practice, abuse of dominant position, and many of those concepts that are regulated under competition law? Or are we seeing a case where there is a panic reaction, knee-jerk reaction, and almost a worry around overregulation as well as policy excessiveness to deal with some of these issues? More importantly, also overlaps between regulators. These are some of the topics that we're hoping to address over the next 45 minutes. And I'm absolutely delighted that we have two real experts to take us through some of these questions. Dr. Shubhashis Gangopadhyay and Dr. Rajat Kathuria, thank you so much for being here on this panel. Let me start by first asking the very basic question that we have as the title of this panel: revisioning competition laws in the digital age. Dr. Gangopadhyay, your opening thoughts on whether we should even think about revisioning and re-examining and revisiting competition laws given the kind of developments we're seeing in the digital age.
The digital economy operates on very different levels compared to the so-called non-digital or classical economy, right? And clearly new ways of doing business have been opened up, and therefore the market play is obviously going to be different from what we had seen in the classical models of economics or non-digital models of economics, right? But one thing we must keep in mind is that whether it is in the classical models or in the digital economy, the companies or firms or players play strategically, right? And that has not changed. And therefore, many of the things that we talk about in terms of how the strategic play prevents others from entering the market, how does it improve consumer welfare, all of which are focus of the competition authorities, they are more or less the same, right? So what we really need is not new laws, but greater understanding of the system. And this is where I think for the regulators, it is important to understand the digital system. And, after yesterday's great day, victory in Australia, I'm pretty confident and I'm pretty sure that we need to, really relearn the way we do things, and probably do not ask me at least to come and talk at these panels, but get some youngsters who know the digital economy better. Because it is important that we get new ideas and new thought into among the regulators, because the digital economy operates very differently from the non-digital economy. And therefore, understanding the digital economy is very, very, very important. So that's all I will say at the outset, yeah.
Sure. I love the way you weaved in yesterday's win into this, and obviously a fantastic and proud moment for each one of us. And going back to the overall message that you have, that, nothing changes. The principles of competition law do not change with new industries coming in, with new sectors growing, and that holds true also for the digital economy. So the basic premise, the basic principles remain. But I think your opening thoughts are around the ability to understand and the ability to be able to navigate the tech ecosystem, because it comes with its own nuances, it comes with its own understanding, and it's very important that regulators are up to speed with how this sector works. Dr. Kathuria, let me bring you in here, because I think what's very important with what Dr. Gangopadhyay has set the stage for in this discussion is that the bigger worry is that if we have regulators who are not able to understand or fathom what some of the challenges challenges of the tech ecosystem are, we actually could be presented with a case where we're going to see a scenario of over-worrying leading to over-regulation. And that in some ways would hurt not just innovation, but even growth of the tech ecosystem that is being talked about as really the bedrock for growth in many economies right now, especially India.
Absolutely right. I couldn't agree more with what Shubhashis has said. And before I answer your question, let me just go back and reinforce what Dr. Gangopadhyay has said, that we don't need a new principle, we don't need new frameworks, we just need to understand the digital economy better. The reasons for market failure remain the same, i.e. there will be monopolies, and probably in the digital case, there will be even more intense and more profound monopolies. There will also be asymmetric information, which is another reason for market failure. And I think information problems, while they will also be addressed because now you have more information available, I think it will also create more asymmetric information because you don't know what is right and what is wrong. So the reasons, as Dada has said, the reasons for market failure remain the same, but our enforcement and our understanding of the digital economy has to improve because it changes the way markets work. And the way, one can think of this is there was another massive change that happened in economic systems, in the classical economic systems several years ago because of the digital economy. But that didn't affect the digital economy as profoundly as it is affecting today. It has to do with trade. What happened to trade at that time was that trade became a lot fragmented. Value chains emerged and trade began to take place in various countries. There was fragmentation of the value chain, and you saw all these logistics improvements because of telecommunications, and outsourcing began to happen. And a laptop was made in 50 different countries. A smartphone today is made in 40 different countries. And people began to ask the same question that you're asking today: do we need to relook at the laws of comparative advantage to sort of capture and cover the new kind of specialization and pattern of international trade that has emerged? And our own, Professor Bhagwati, Srinivasan, and Arvind Panagaria wrote a very nice piece in the Journal of Economic Perspective saying that, look, we don't need to relook at the laws of comparative advantage. The laws of comparative advantage are there, and that principle can exist to the fragmentation of trade. And if I use that example to the digital economy, if you just extend that example and just reinforce what has already been said, is that you don't need to relook at markets, you just need to understand those markets better. And to your question, how do we get better understanding in the regulatory system? I think there are two things here. One is the institutional design, which is going to be important. And the second thing that is going to be important is how do you staff the regulators? So design is going to be important. And I worked in a regulator myself, and I know there are a lot of sectoral regulators in India. And the question that we have to ask ourselves in this digital space is, because it's so cross-cutting, is do we need a sectoral regulator for data, or do we need existing regulators to strengthen their ability to regulate? So that's one question. And in the background of that question is sort of regulatory proliferation that has happened in India. And that has been used as a sinecure often for people to find jobs post-retirement. And I think that's something that needs to be addressed. And second, of course, is the staffing of the regulator, the expertise of the regulator. One of the ways this has been addressed in mature markets is to have people from the private sector come in and work with the regulator and try and come in, build capacity and help. There are some, learning for the regulators by secondments from private sector. Now that model, I don't know whether, given the trust deficit that exists, whether that model will work in India. But capacity is absolutely essential, because if you don't have capacity, and as you said, Shweta, you tend to either over-regulate or not regulate, and you won't be able to create a balance. There's no question that you need to regulate, but you need to regulate in a manner that is optimal, and don't jump in just because you need to jump in. As Professor Bhagwati used to often say, bureaucrats in India were obligated to take decisions because files used to come to them, and you were obligated to take decisions, whether those decisions were right or not. And I think we should resist the tendency of taking decisions just because we are empowered to take decisions. Sometimes not taking a decision is also a good decision.
No, I think a very valid point from you there, Dr. Kathuria. And I'd like to delve a little deeper into one of the points that you raised, which is around where and how should the tech economy get regulated, because the dangers around overregulation continue to remain. And one of the big worries that we are facing right now is overlap amongst regulators. And that's something that is already happening between the competition regulator on one hand, as well as the privacy regulator on the other hand. When we really look at the entire tech ecosystem, we understand that there are privacy laws being framed around the world. We know the GDPR is in place. We know the US is going through its own evolution of statewide privacy laws, as well as talking about a national privacy law. But most importantly, here in India, we're right in the midst of a personal data protection bill that is likely to get passed very soon, which will be the overarching regulation for the tech ecosystem. And we understand that it could come up as soon as the budget session of Parliament, when the Joint Parliamentary Committee will submit its report. Now, the question that I have for the two of you is that at a time when there will be a data protection authority set up under the new act, at a time when India will have an independent personal data protection law to govern the tech ecosystem, is there a case for the competition regulator to even look into any of these issues, or should there be a very clear demarcation of lines and just allow the data protection authority to do that and not the competition authority? Dr. Gangopadhyay, maybe I'd come to you first on that. Yes, that would be great.
Okay. First, there are a few things that Rajat just said, and the answer to the question that you have posed will have to be seen in that light. He made a number of good points. One point was that a number of points that I agree with may not be good points, Rajat, but at least the points I fully agree with, which is one is that you cannot run policy, right? Especially regulatory policies, with voluntary support from the private sector. This is an absolutely no-no model, right? Because there are interests are in conflict. That's the whole idea of the regulator, right? So and almost all the policy making that is happening in the digital sphere is happening with so-called volunteers from the private sector, and that is a very dangerous approach, right? So I want to re-emphasize that point. And the second thing he said is about too many regulators. Indeed, if you look at the way the digital thing is evolving, the digital policy making is evolving in India, almost every day there is a new authority being proposed, right? So you talked about the data authority, but you have personal data and non-personal data. They're already talking about two different authorities, right? Now, clearly the NPD, given the digital economy, starts with PD, right, or personal data. Now you're going to make it non-personal, right, by anonymization or what have you. Now, if there are two different authorities looking at these things, there'll be disaster, right? So this is going to result in a really difficult situation. So I want to re-emphasize what Rajat said. Now, coming back, the privacy, you mentioned GDPR, right? One of the worst things that we are doing is that how we build up our digital economy is a strategic point, right? India has to decide for itself what would be the structure of India's digital economy, given the fact that we have the largest young population, we have a huge market, and we have really well-trained people here in India too, who can actually carry the innovation forward. So what is our strategic play to make sure that the values that they can generate stay within the country? Right? So that's our target. I'm saying this because you mentioned GDPR. The worst thing that we are doing is we are trying to follow what every other country has done, which they've all done to take into account their strategic interests. And we are taking bits and pieces of things from there and trying to put it on us. This is an absolute no-no. If we really want to develop as a country, then we must have our own strategies and we must decide how we are going to play it out. And hence, you're indeed correct that the privacy bill or the privacy law, when it comes out, is the bedrock on which everything else has to be built. And therefore, all these things that we are doing with various policy proposals, without knowing what the privacy bill will look like, and what it will allow and what it will not allow, I think is a waste of time, because we have to wait to see, right, what the privacy bill is and then start building on that, because that's a given, right? So all the things that we're discussing about what is non-personal data and what is personal data, all of those will become clear. The one other point I want to raise is the following. I'm sorry, I'm taking a little bit of time, but let me explain this.
Sure.
That it is important to understand this thing that we are mixing up data privacy with two other concepts, which is control of data and ownership of data. This has nothing to do with the value creation of data and the extraction of value for our citizens, right? So our data, how much value we are going to extract from that for our citizens, that's the strategy. Well, think about it. If I'm a factory worker, I get paid for the work I do. I don't control or I don't own the product that I'm producing, even though it is my work that is generating the value. So this mixing up, the fact that it is my data, therefore I must own or I must control it, has nothing to do with the value that I can extract from that data. So we have to be able to understand this.
Sure, I think you've made a very valid point, and we'd like to take that point forward as well, as in terms of value of data. And I think a lot of fear that is coming around this discussion is based on the entire idea that tech companies today are very powerful. Tech companies access tons of data, and that data gives them the ability to have some sort of a dominant position, which in many cases has been found to be untrue. But at least the notion exists that just the fact that they have the ability to collect and the ability to use that data makes them, more prone or vulnerable to be subjected to similar, concerns around whether it is anti-competitive. Dr. Kathuria, I think we need to go a little deeper into this and understand whether some of this kind of notion itself and this kind of regulation of the value of data and incorporating that within in the entire premise of competition law is fair or not.
No, they have to be in competition law. The question, I don't think the question is whether this needs to be regulated or not. As I said, the question is how it should be regulated. As Shubhashis said, that data in my hands doesn't have value, but data in somebody else's hands, and when there is agglomeration of data, when you collect data, data has value. And that value tends to get exploited. Now, there has been also a discussion amongst people, is that if the property rights of that data lie with the company and that data is mine, how can I have a sharing mechanism to be able to give me back the value that my data has created for the company? I mean, these are issues that have been discussed, and it's a sort of a unique model, is that I'm in fact the company is paying for your data and is then has the right to use it. The other way, of course, companies have a right to use the data is that there is consent. I mean, when I'm signing on to a particular platform, I'm giving consent, and that consent could run into 45 pages. And if you remember a very famous case that happened in France, I believe several years ago, when I think one of the big platform companies was taken to court by an individual or by the European Commission, and they pleaded that they had got consent from the individuals. But the court then proceeded to say that, well, you got consent, but that consent was, in a sense, process-oriented. It wasn't informed consent. So what is important in law is that whether the consent is informed or not. And I think that's an important, because there's a lot of consent fatigue right now. But I think the debate between the private sector, and let's say I take private sector at one extreme and I take NGOs at other extreme. Private sector says that data is value, data is oil, and I can reap the benefits, not only for myself, but for the rest of the economy, so I improve social welfare. And lots of examples are given in terms of public services, the non-personal data. I can repair roads, I can repair pipes, I can repair the electricity grid when it fails, that kind of example, and that can improve public welfare. And on the other hand, there are examples where private companies, of course, profit from this data. There's targeted advertising, and sometimes you get inundated with that. So one has to sort of try and create a balance between the two. On the other hand, I think there is a debate among NGOs and privacy activists, which I think is not very constructive. It could be persuasive, or it could be it could be appealing, but it's not very constructive because they say data is toxic, right? And when you begin to define data as toxic, because it's being used by companies for their benefit to the detriment of consumers, my data is all out there, etc. Keeping aside all the arguments, I put my data there myself, but I haven't given consent for you to use it and abuse it, etc. Keeping all these factors in mind, I think data will create value. It's going to be an extremely difficult task to be able to utilize, create value for us, and to create a good institutional design where we can actually leverage a lot of the value we create. I agree with, let me end by saying, let me again contextualize this in a geopolitical sense and then reinforce what Shubhashis said, which is, if you look at the current battle between the United States and China, especially in the tech space and the trade war, I think the trade war is pretty much premised on trying to attain technological superiority in the digital space, in the AI space. And whatever you see on trade restriction, import tariffs, etc., I think are following from that. The US is extremely concerned and vulnerable at China's prowess in information technology, digital, and AI, because AI could be the new military. Right? Instead of troops and tanks, it could be the new military. Cyber warfare could be the new pattern of warfare. And America is obviously concerned. And one of the reasons that tech companies in the United States used to give the American regulators is that you don't allow us to access private data as easily as the Chinese do, because the Chinese have access to so much data, and data is the feedstock of artificial intelligence. They're able to steal a march on us because they have access to these whole amounts, mountain loads of data, and they are progressing much faster than us. So the American companies made a plea to the American regulators that they should also get access to their data of their citizens. And as far as privacy is concerned, you look the other way. I think this is a dangerous argument to make, and it's almost a self-serving argument that is being made. Yes, data should be made available, but I think privacy and individual rights should be respected, not to the extent that activists want it to be respected, but to the extent that you create a balance between privacy and value creation.
No, I think you've made some very, very relevant and important points there, and specifically around geopolitics today playing a role in a lot of policy making and decisions and actions by governments around the world. There specifically, I'd like to focus around why there is sometimes a misplaced understanding on how to regulate data. And you made a very relevant argument there around how people view data as oil. And while that analogy was made initially to perhaps reflect the value of data today, that today data is as valuable as oil used to be, the danger of that analogy is that regulation seems to be going in the direction of trying to regulate data exactly the way oil was regulated. And one of the basic premise of that is perhaps saying, data localization is the need of the hour. You need to keep data literally locked up under borders because cross-border data flows can lead to national security concerns. But the others, many who are from the tech world argue just the opposite. And they're like, in today's times, we're living in a global economy where tech, as you mentioned, Dr. Kathuria, will be the big deciding factor in determining the power of countries. And if you do not allow innovation, if you do not take advantage of cloud efficiencies as well as cross-border data flows, you're actually putting your own country at a disadvantage. So when you have these in some ways opposing objectives that policymakers have to worry about, we do see sometimes regulation coming out where we have to understand why and where the government's coming from. the one aspect that I want to touch forward is the non-personal data framework that India is talking about, where India, to your point, Dr. Gangopadhyay, on non-personal data, India seems to be the only country in the world that's looking at regulating it. So yes, while on a lot of other issues, we seem to be in some ways emulating what other countries are doing on non-personal data. This is India's way. But a lot of questions and worries from around the world on whether the entire premise of regulating non-personal data in some ways may be actually based on something that lies in competition law, which is worries that perhaps the tech ecosystem with large tech companies or early movers have access to data that may be putting them at an unfair advantage, and the need for those companies to be able to share the data, both with the government and even with competitors. I'd love your thoughts on that very premise, because in some ways, isn't that something that a competition regulator should deal with in any case, and something that should be part of the privacy law when it comes to personal data protection? But having a separate architecture altogether to deal with non-personal data that still has many concerns around whether it's truly anonymous, whether it can be re-identified, is this really a mandate of a competition regulator or a privacy regulator? It's throwing up a lot of uncomfortable questions. Would love your thoughts around how India is thinking of non-personal data regulation.
Well, in economics, there's something called observables and unobservables. So I don't know how India is thinking, but I can observe what they're saying, right? And it makes me a little bit nervous. So the observables, right? Now, you talked about non-personal data and the fact that companies which control this data could prevent innovators from getting a hand on this data. Now, please understand, there are two parts to this. Suppose I'm a platform, right? And therefore, anybody operating on the platform gives me data, right? Which I can value or use for generating value. Now, there are two sides who are playing on the platform, right? Those who are selling and those who are buying. Now, we mix up the competition among the buyers and sellers with the platform. Now, this is a very easy way to stop it, right? The platform should not be selling its own items. You can stop all such use of dominance, right? The platform depends on network economies or network externalities. So the larger the platform, the more value is being generated. Again, the issue is, how is that value being extracted and by whom? That's the strategic ploy I'm talking about. That's the strategic approach that must be taken. But if you want to, because somebody is generating a lot of value, if you want to stop that platform from generating that value by putting restrictions, then it will harm everybody, because these platforms depend on network externalities. We should not mix up the competition among those who are operating on the platform with competition of the platform itself. That's step one in the understanding. The next step in the understanding is this thing about controlling non-personal data in India being unique in when I say that we follow other countries rather than think on our own, I'm not saying that we have done everything which is a carbon copy of what others have done. Remember, we always then twist it to satisfy whatever it is that we want to do. Right? Because, when we were growing up, you have missed it. But when we were growing up, it was standard to say that, but in a country like India, these things cannot happen. So we would tweak everything, and the only argument we would give is that India is a different country. And for the NPD, if you observe, we're doing exactly the same. We are saying that India is a different country. However, we're picking up things from every other country. And then the way we're mixing it is out. I'm saying that first step should not be done. That picking up from other countries should not be done. In the non-personal data space, right, what we are saying non-personal is essentially that which is anonymized. If I cannot identify that this is Rajat's data, it is non-personalized, right? And we'll all agree that yes, that's fair case. Now, please understand, if I am holding on to a large amount of data, the only way I can generate value for myself from that is if I sell either the data to others or sell the services of the data to others. Now, if I'm selling the services of the data to others, right, then you're talking of how to tax me, that's what governments are there for. It's nothing to do with competition. Because as I said, we know that network externalities exist, so platforms will be large dominant players. The game is nothing to do with competition. The game is with how to extract that value for our citizens. Right? If, on the other hand, we are using the data to sell services, which nobody else can, because I only have the data, then you talk of competition. Are those service production being restricted? Would other competitors also using the data would have produced greater service, right? There is no understanding of this distinction in what is going on. That is what bothers.
It's also way more complicated in the tech world. Dr. Kathuria, your quick thoughts on non-personal data, and then I'll move on to one other relevant question that's being asked.
So, the point that Shubhashis made about, companies becoming big because they have access to information, they have access to data, all this data, and they're the ones who create value. And this discussion is happening even as we speak, not only in India, but it's happening in the EU, in the US. And there's a landmark case in the US today where one of the big platforms has been, one of the rulings has been to break up the company. There's a strategic structural remedy that has been sort of stated in the judgment. And I think that's absolutely the wrong way to go. If I were a regulator and I became big because I've got access to this information and non-personal data and I'm creating value out of it, as Shubhashis said, you are going to become big because of network effects. You break me up and I'm going to become big because I'm creating value from that data that I'm either selling or creating value and services from the data I'm selling. And I have a comparative advantage or a competitive advantage, and I'm able to leverage that. So if I'm using non-personal data to become big, that doesn't mean you are going to break me up because I'm doing something well. Now, so a structural remedy in the digital space, in the oil case, Standard Oil, break up Standard Oil, break up AT&T. They even wanted to break up Microsoft in 1998. Luckily, that didn't happen. So I don't believe that structural remedy is going to be an answer to the question of regulation in this space. It's going to be, very quick, efficient, rapid, and penal enforcement that becomes a sort of advertisement for the rest of the companies not to do. India is often accused of being a soft state. Arey, kuch nahi hoga, nothing will happen. This case will carry on for years and we'll continue to abuse the law as much as possible. India often having been accused as a soft state. But we need to be able to understand that there are other aspects of abuse of dominance that we need to sort of address in this space. And let me just mention one, and Shubhashis has already mentioned it, in the techies of this world, and I've been working in this space for some time, call it the kill zone. The kill zone is an area where we need to genuinely be worried about. IBM has practiced that for several years in the past. You buy up competitors, suppress innovation so that you can remain dominant. And that's something which is a reasonable worry, I think, in this space. And regulators will have to be able to identify which is a takeover, which is a merger, or which is an acquisition, which tries to suppress competition or creates entry barriers, or which one is going to enhance welfare. And it's a non-trivial task. It's clearly non-trivial, but this is something that we have to understand.
Now, staying with that thought around mergers and acquisitions, around dominant position, how are we defining this in the tech age? I think it's also very relevant because we've moved away from a market which was always traditional or offline or brick and mortar, as we used to call it, to now having a market which is both online and offline. And very often, because we're seeing such amazing growth and success stories coming out from the tech ecosystem, those numbers, that data point makes huge headlines and catches the eye of regulators in terms of, oh my God, this is the largest so-and-so company or the e-commerce company or ride-sharing company and all of that. However, very often we forget that when we look at the traditional definition of market, the way a competition regulator needs to see it, the market still continues to be both online and offline. So are we agreed that when it comes to understanding and defining dominant position in terms of competition and assessing if any activity or a merger and acquisition is triggering anti-competitive practice, we need to understand that the market still remains the larger market and not see it from the lens of just being offline?
I mean, that is the most critical question, Shweta. And I mean, there are examples, and lawyers spend so much time, depending on which side you are from, either defining the market in a very, very narrow sense or defining the market in a very wide scope. And that is really the key for competition regulation. What is the relevant market? If you just go back to the celebrated Microsoft case, Microsoft argued in the case in the district court in the United States that the market for the operating system was not just the desktop operating system, but it was the operating system wherever the operating system worked, whether it was tablets, whether it was smartphones, whether it was desktop. It was even gaming consoles had an operating system, and that should be included in the definition of the relevant market. On the other hand, the district court took the argument from the plaintiff that the operating system was limited to desktop operating systems only. So once you narrow the denominator, you're obviously going to get dominance per se. But I think dominance in these markets is going to be a given. However narrowly you define the market, some companies are still necessarily going to be very, very large in terms of market share.
Sure, but I think, as we said, that this is a debate around the world, and there are cases to look at. But Dr. Gangopadhyay, do you believe that in some ways tech companies are unfairly targeted just because of the kind of growth and scale they've achieved in a short period of time, and that catches the eye of regulators? Whereas, to be fair to them, we need a wider understanding because they are still operating in a market which is a larger market. So the narrower definition of market would be unfair.
See, this is not a question of fairness, right? The economists have no definition of fairness. So the economists get very nervous if you ask them for a fair price or a fair deal, because we have no objective definition of fairness. So let's forget fairness, but let's ask the following question. Now, well before the digital world, it was well known that companies merge. We may give it a good flavor and say synergy and all of that, but companies merge to essentially restrict competition. Because that's the strategic interest of companies, right? If I see a competitor coming up, then it is in my interest to ensure that I either beat the competition or, they take it in. The thing that authorities try to do is look at the balance, right? And make sure that it doesn't, in the process, it doesn't harm consumers, right? That's the only thing. So similarly, when we're talking about, Rajat referred to the kill zone. This is before the digital world. I attended a conference where the CEO of a pharma company, had a talk whose heading was 1 + 1 = 1. And he was arguing that this big pharma companies buying up the biotech R&D labs has essentially reduced innovation, not added to it. Right? So 1 + 1 was not equal to 3 as was expected, synergy and all of that, but 1 + 1 is equal to 1. That was his talk, and he was the CEO of the third largest pharma company at that time, right? So this is a well-known story. Economists are aware of this, that the whole idea of merger and acquisition is to beat the competition, because that is the strategic play. Now, therefore, if we say, no, you're not allowed to do that, you're destroying the whole idea of what we want companies to do and how we want to maintain balance for consumers, which is the regulator's job, right? As Rajat said, to generate that balance. So this is a tough task, right? And you cannot just sit down and make laws and get it over with. So you have to be constantly on the job, and that's what regulators do. They study the market as it evolves. They don't sit down and design the markets like we are trying to do in our regulatory approach, right? So you have to let the markets play and then step in wherever consumers are being affected. And hence, in that context, yes, we are being unfair to the big tech company, because we are not We do want them to compete. We do want them to generate value. We do want them to be strategic in their play and then say, but you can't.
Right.
That is being unfair.
I
That
think
part
you
is
said
being
that
unfair.
so well, because absolutely right, and that's the conundrum we're facing right now, and I think conflicting objectives, both on part of policymakers and regulators, and lack of understanding. As you started this discussion with Dr. Gangopadhyay, there is a complete lack of understanding and appreciation on how the tech ecosystem works. So, Dr. Kathuria talked about consent, and consent has been debated and been part of so many privacy laws. Yet we don't have the right answer on how to deal with some of these real basic policy issues. I know we just have a couple of minutes left, but we have some questions from the audience, which I'd love to just take up before we end. One of the questions says that should India regulate competition in the digital sector for Atmanirbhar Bharat? I know you both have touched upon this and the geopolitics playing a part in economics and policy making, but maybe a quick response from any of you on this.
Yeah.
Yes, Dr. Gangopadhyay, please go ahead.
See, Atmanirbhar Bharat is a strategy, right? I presume it's a strategy, and that's a good strategy because, as Rajat said, in the technological world, with the geopolitics and all of that, you have to be sure that your economic activities are controlled by you. May not be owned by you, but at least controlled by you. Right? And therefore, we cannot be Atmanirbhar in the old sense of self-sufficiency, right? But we have to be Atmanirbhar in the sense that we have to strategically ensure that there are certain things that we do not ask anybody or do not have to depend on anybody to do. And at the same time, everybody else has to ask us. Right? That's called the position of strength. And in that sense, if I take Atmanirbhar Bharat, right, then it's a fantastic strategy. For example, should we be the 5G power? The battle is lost. Should we move ahead and look into the future? Then all the strategy, all the actions that we take have to be moved in that direction, right? And that is what is called a country strategy. Country strategy is not looking at what other countries have done and take their policies and implement it and hope that we'll get. We followed Japan in the 60s. It didn't work. We followed South Korea after that. It didn't work. We followed East Asia. It didn't work. We are trying to follow China for the last 2 decades. It's not working. Our own strategy we have.
Right. And with that, I want to pose the last question, which has also come from the audience for closing comments to Dr. Kathuria, which I think is, again, the premise of the discussion we've been having, a rather interesting one. What are the challenges being faced by regulators while dealing with digital services? So I think that's something we started by talking about, and maybe have your closing thoughts there, Dr. Kathuria.
Well, I think this is something which we haven't seen in the past, as we've been saying that you don't need to change the premise or the framework or the principles of regulation. But given that these services are new, given that there are markets that have emerged that did not exist in the past, and they've emerged because of information flows. For example, a very good cliche that went around several years ago was that the biggest retail company did not own a store, the biggest hotel company did not own a single hotel, and the biggest taxi fleet did not own a single taxi. I mean, that's the world that we are talking about. And I remember, there were small taxi operators who used to run Fiats and Ambassadors, and they started then running the Mercedes and BMWs as a part of their fleet. And I asked them, how did you suddenly migrate from these cars, low value cars, to these very high value cars? He said we could keep track of our drivers. We knew exactly where the driver was, we knew exactly where the car was, and we could take a track where they were going, and we were able to offer. So that was information that was leading to more efficient and creating value in the market. Of course, what also happens in this place of information overload is that you cannot differentiate between what is fake, what is real, and what is untrue. So what regulators need to do is to resist the temptation of jumping in when they don't have enough understanding in the digital space. You do need to jump in because, as we've been saying, there is scope for market failure and sometimes more intense market failure. You need to jump in, but you need to be very careful. And I think you can only be careful if you are have capacity to understand what is happening in the market. My sort of experience as a regulator suggests that the regulated entity is perhaps 2 to 3 steps ahead of the regulator all the time. And in the digital space, it's perhaps going to be 10 steps ahead of the time. But resist the temptation to jump in where you have less understanding, because taking no decision is also a decision. Saying that this is right for the market, there's a very good quote in Professor Bhagwati's book, is that if India opens up, this is talking about the 60s and 70s, if India opens up its market, we will fritter our resources away on brill cream and powder, while the person who said that, Professor Bhagwati said, sitting next to him, had brill cream in his hair. So you understand what that means, is that you think that what is right for the masses, what is right for the others, while you yourself are very happy to use those services that are available. I mean, that's not the right way to regulate markets, especially in the digital space.
I think that's a perfect note to end this discussion, Dr. Kathuria. Thank you for that wonderful example. And as you said, just summing up what both Dr. Gangopadhyay as well as Dr. Kathuria have said, I think we've never had a more precise and clear discussion around a topic which is so hotly debated. But I think the fact remains that the basic premise, the basic principles of competition law do not change. Never mind the explosion in the digital economy, never mind the fact that we're seeing new age players emerge. So it's very important that we do not be in a rush to redefine it just because the economy is changing its color, the economy is changing its face, and the economy is coming up with newer players and newer actors. At the same time, what would be important is for regulators to update and understand the functioning of the sector very well, because unless they do that, as Dr. Kathuria has been saying, they may make decisions which would be far worse than not taking any decision at all. Because at a time when you have to spur innovation, where you have to allow market forces to function, where you have to allow some of these large tech players to continue doing what they're doing, which is provide some wonderful digital services to each one of us as consumers, we may see regulation coming in the way of that growth. And lastly, and I think most importantly, as we have been talking, as we see technology emerge, as we see regulations come up, the biggest dangers of policy excessiveness and over-regulation remain. That's why a very clear understanding of the India way, as Dr. Gangopadhyay has been saying, India having its own independent strategy at the same time, which is also one that allows interoperability of global laws, but a strategy that does not lead to overlap between regulators, because the worst thing you can do to an economy that is taking off, to a sector that's giving back so much, is lead to confused, muddled policy making and over-regulation, with every regulator trying to do their bit. And what you see as a result is a complete mess out there. So thank you both for joining us and sharing that perspective. I truly enjoyed this conversation, and I'm sure it is going to be a hotly debated topic for many, many years going forward. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Dada. Thank you, Shweta.
Thank you, Rajat. Thank you, Shweta.
Well, thanks to all three of you for such an engaging session. We really appreciate you making time out of your busy schedules to join us for this. With that, we come to the end of this session. Please stay tuned in for the other sessions. Goodbye. Stay safe.
Bye-bye.